Thank you so much, David. Thank you for the opportunity to present the paper and for being here today. What I want to start by saying is that often when I'm asked by diplomats, if I'm in Europe, or less in the US, but how can we help? What can we do for peace? Actually, my answer is always, if we were left alone, it would be best. Because I do believe that we do not benefit from having this conflict being constantly played out on the international stage. But I generally immediately acknowledge that we are not going to be left alone. That's not likely to happen. And countries from around the world, and certainly Western countries, are heavily involved in this conflict, like it or not. So what this paper is basically looking is what Western countries are doing with respect to the conflict, to making peace, to preserving or trying to achieve a two-state solution, and whether that's helpful, how it can be more helpful, and whether we're witnessing a changing paradigm. Because what appears to be happening at the moment is that there's a general sense that the two-state solution, such that it ever was a solution, is in jeopardy. And is that it is in jeopardy from a variety of directions, the growing intellectual discourse of the one-state solution, the current Israeli government, and its nominations, appointments, and the policies of some of its senior nominations and appointments who are opposed to a two-state solution, the settlement building, President Abbas's call for the world to stop focusing on negotiations and take international action. So it seems that from a whole variety of direction, there's a sense that the two-state solution is in jeopardy, and yet it still remains the most widely accepted idea for how we can have peace between Jews and Arabs in the small piece of land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. Now, for quite a few decades, the governing paradigm of how Western countries looked at the conflict was negotiations. Direct negotiations based on the 242 Land for Peace formula that over time became more detailed in the roadmap. But the notion has been to privilege the process over the outcome. So the idea was that no matter what is happening, the support is for direct negotiations, and generally sanction is for those who try to circumvent negotiations to achieve outcomes in the absence of negotiations. But what seems to be increasingly happening is a certain frustration, which is openly expressed by many countries and their leaders, that negotiations have failed to lead to the desired outcome. And therefore, if we cannot trust negotiations, and as I said, President Abbas even called for clearly abandoning the paradigm of negotiations, what can be done to achieve an outcome that is the desired outcome? And we are seeing in this context a variety of actions taking place. Most prominently is the direct recognition to a state of Palestine, labeling of settlement products, French and New Zealand efforts currently at bay but might be renewed of a United Nations Security Council resolution, occasional debate on whether the United States might not veto such resolutions, so leave the floor open for them to move forward. So we're seeing things taking shape, votes in parliament. Just now, Greece is emerging as a country that is looking to recognize Palestine in addition to the vote in parliament. So what I decided to look is, where is all of this leading? What would happen if Western countries basically decided to say, okay, negotiations are not leading to the outcome that we envisioned, so we are going to try to create this outcome in the absence of negotiations. And I am not prescribing this. I'm not saying that this is what should be done. As I said, I personally believe if we were left alone without the global spotlight and attention, we would have long ago managed some agreements. But I'm describing and trying to analyze what might happen given this combination of frustration with negotiations and a sense that the two-state solution is in jeopardy. So I began to look at what negotiations have yielded. So negotiations have not yielded peace and have not yielded anything close to peace. But they have yielded, over more than 20 years of negotiations, a certain kind of more detailed understanding of what peace would look like were it to be achieved. Often known in the phrase of, we all know what peace looks like, or we all know what a two-state solution looks like. And it is a combination of a variety of actions, repeated rounds of negotiations, the roadmap, the Geneva Track 2 agreements. All of these have ultimately yielded a set of what could be called preferences. So these are the more detailed preferences of the West for the outcome, for what a two-state solution would look like in practice. They basically include the following four elements. The first is the establishment of an Arab-Palestinian state side by side with the state of Israel. In the paper, I reflect to it as a question of status. Recognized borders that separate the state of Israel and the state of Palestine based on the 1967 or the 1949 ceasefire agreements, with some land that includes major settlement blocks annexed to Israel, and in exchange, equivalent land being given to the state of Palestine, so that the territory of the state of Palestine is equivalent to the territory of the West Bank and Gaza, if not exactly the territory of the West Bank and Gaza. This is the issue of borders. Jerusalem as the capital of both states, with residential West Jerusalem and the Jewish neighborhoods of East Jerusalem to be the capital of Israel, the residential Arab neighborhoods of East Jerusalem to be the capital of Palestine, and a special status for what is called the Holy Basin, the 1 square kilometer of the Old City and a few adjacent sites, that is mostly focused on how to ensure religious observance for all. So this is the question of Jerusalem, and what is called in the roadmap an agreed, just, fair, and realistic solution to the refugee issue, which has generally come to mean that those internally displaced people, refugees, and their descendants, today registered by UNRWA to be 5 million, the Palestinians include more, to even say 7 or 8 million, would have a right to live in Palestine. They will also be, those of them who want, have a right to settle in the countries where some of them live today, such as Jordan, Syria, such as it is, and Lebanon, and that they will have a measure of compensation, and that the state of Israel will accept some of the original refugees and their descendants. The numbers are listed from several thousand to several tens of thousands over the years, but with the understanding that whatever the number is that Israel accepts, it represents an end to all claims and the closure of the issue. And this is what is referred to this paper as a question of the displaced persons, refugees, and their descendants. So what I said, given that these are the preferences and the more detailed understanding of what a two-state solution would look like, and that has emerged from over 20 years of negotiations, where did the policies of Western countries stand with respect to their preferences? If this is the preference for outcome, do their policies reflect that preference? And basically the short answer is no. And sometimes it's a big no. For example, almost all Western countries want to see a state of Palestine emerge, all Western countries. But almost all of them do not recognize a state of Palestine as existing in the present. They say it does not exist, but it should exist. And in that sense, their policy is not aligned with their preference for the outcome of a Palestinian state. This is the one issue where we're beginning to see a breaking of rank with the traditional paradigm that negotiations should determine the emergence of a Palestinian state, most notably Sweden, but before that Iceland, and recently the Vatican, and maybe now Greece, that have bilaterally and directly recognized a state of Palestine as existing now. And this is a line that has been in the past preserved. Many Western countries have offered the Palestinians the trappings of a state, recognizing their representatives as ambassadors, but never recognizing Palestine as a state that exists. It appears to be changing as more and more countries are looking to align their policy with preference and to say, since our preference is for the emergence of a Palestinian state, we will actually recognize it as existing now. On the issue of borders, what is happening there is what I call essentially an overshooting. All Western countries basically treat all Israeli presence beyond the 1949 ceasefire lines as illegal, regardless of whether you think that's right or not right. This is the reigning consensus. And the view is that they're all equal. It could be a neighbor, it could be the Gilon neighborhood, it could be an outpost on the mountains in the West Bank. They are all equally illegal, equally condemned. In that respect, there's an overshooting where there's no incorporation of the fact that whether it's the Bush letter or the Arab League declarations that have allowed for swaps, there is an understanding that the 1949 ceasefire lines will not be the borders, but there is no treatment in policy of Western countries that we have already moved to a different view of equivalent territory rather than the precise border. And to align policy with preference in this case would require Western countries to actually do the hard work of delineating some kind of border, of saying, okay, we accept, because there's the notion of the settlement blocks, but it's never been established. So there's nothing that says, okay, we accept that these are the 2-3% of the West Bank that will be part of Israel in any future agreement. We will no longer condemn building in this land, but everything else we will take harsher measures. This would be a more proper alignment of policy with preference, but at the moment, and we are seeing it with the labeling issue, the tendency is to maintain the overshooting policy, which does not recognize the developments that have taken place in negotiations. The issue of Jerusalem is particularly interesting because here Western countries remain attached to the 1947 partition proposal. And that shows you how much their policy differs from their preference. According to the 1947 partition proposal, Jerusalem, and that is a large swath of area that includes all of Jerusalem today plus Beit Lehem, belongs to no one. And the official policy of all Western countries with respect to Israel is that Jerusalem belongs to no one. As a result, there's no recognition of even West Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, no Western embassies, none at all in West Jerusalem. You will see it here in various comments. Tel Aviv opposes that, even though there's no Tel Aviv as a seat of government. So complete denial that the West Jerusalem is the capital of the state of Israel. And yet, in many sayings and declarations, East Jerusalem is treated as Palestine. You will hear being said occupied Palestinian territory, occupied Palestinian Jerusalem. So what is happening, and again, the case of Sweden is particularly instructive, Sweden declared that after it recognized Palestine, it will see its consuls in Sheikh Jarrah that are in East Jerusalem as the ambassadors to Palestine, that it will not open an embassy in Ramallah. So what do we have here? Sweden recognizes Palestine, but the ambassador to Palestine from Sweden lives in East Jerusalem, in Arab East Jerusalem, yet Sweden will not take the corresponding step of moving its ambassador to West Jerusalem. So basically, Israel is judged by the 1947 ideas, and the Palestinians are looked at through the 1967 lens. There's no consistency, no coherence on that, and if policy were to be aligned with preference, what we would see is a recognition of residential West Jerusalem as the official capital of Israel, including moving of embassies, recognition of residential Arab East Jerusalem as the capital of Palestine, and a continued effort to ensure that the Holy Basin remains open to religious worship to all religions. The notion of the separate corpus, the corpus separatum of Jerusalem, which was the 1947 notion for all of Jerusalem, could be now limited only to the Holy Basin. And finally, on the issue of refugees and their descendants, here I find the most glaring inconsistency between policy and preference, because the preference is for peace by means of two states for two people. The Jewish people have a right to self-determination. The Arab Palestinians have a right to self-determination. And yet, Western countries are almost the sole supporters of a UN agency called UNRWA that essentially perpetuates the notion that the Palestinian refugees and their descendants have a right to become citizens of the State of Israel, the so-called right of return. Those who fund UNRWA, including the United States, claim that their funding for UNRWA does not mean that they condone the UNRWA notion that refugees and their descendants have a right to return to Israel. But actually, they do. This is what's happening in practice, and the Palestinians, in many ways, in a great paper by the International Crisis Group recently published on this, showed that they view international support for UNRWA as a guarantee that the international community supports their right of return. And again, the case of Sweden is instructive. Sweden recognized Palestine as a country already existing. Sweden is also one of the largest single country donors to UNRWA. Now, this means that while Sweden says that Palestine exists in the West Bank and Gaza, it also supports an organization that says that about 2 million people who live in the West Bank and Gaza, most of whom were born there, lived there their entire lives, have never been displaced, are refugees from Palestine. So they live in Palestine, but they're refugees from Palestine. This can only be squared if the Palestine they are refugees from is Greater Palestine, the Palestine that will one day supersede Israel. This is not a policy that is in line with the idea of support for two states for two people. A coherent policy would recognize Palestine in the West Bank and Gaza, and then immediately argue that those who live in Palestine are no longer refugees from Palestine, and those who live outside can be granted citizenship and be acknowledged as citizens of Palestine living elsewhere, but not as refugees from Palestine. So if Western countries were to go to the logical end of the idea of trying to focus on outcomes rather than on the process, a full, consistent alignment of their policy with their preference would mean recognizing a state of Palestine fully and directly, with its capital in residential Arab East Jerusalem, while focusing on worship rights in the Holy Basin, doing that in borders that reflect the idea of swaps for settlement blocks, and acknowledging that those who live in Palestine are no longer refugees from Palestine. That would be a full and coherent policy. And finally, I end the piece by saying that, will this promote peace? Because the argument of countries that recognize Palestine or label settlement products is that this will help peace. And what I'm arguing is that the only way that this has a chance of helping peace is if it is done as a package in a coherent manner, not just recognizing Palestine. Because if you recognize Palestine but leave your embassy in East Jerusalem without moving your embassy to West Jerusalem while continuing to argue that those who live in Palestine are refugees from Palestine, you're sending a terribly mixed message about what you're trying to achieve. So the only way this can even begin to have impact is to do all of it fully and consistently and coherently. And finally, I speculate that this might actually be helpful to the cause of peace because it operates in line with prospect theory. If you know prospect theory by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, basically says that people value benefits less than they fear loss, the equivalent loss. So people operate according to the idea that they're not trying to maximize the benefits, they're more likely to try to minimize their costs, their risks. And what I'm saying that this policy actually will work with prospect theory, because what does it do? It basically gives up all the advantages ahead of time. Recognizing Palestine, moving embassies to West Jerusalem, doing all of these things which were kept in the past as bargaining chips for a final status agreement, will be given up in advance with no expectation of return, because this benefit is less valuable than previously thought, according to prospect theory, but it would also be minimizing the loss that both sides feel. Because if everyone recognizes a state of Palestine, for Israel to recognize it no longer becomes a huge concession. If the world no longer supports, and the Western world no longer supports the idea of a right of return, the Palestinians might continue to dream of it, but they will no longer feel that they are losing something that the entire world supports. That would minimize, perhaps, the sense of loss. The same for Jerusalem and borders. So this, if it is applied fully, coherently, and consistently, might actually help promote the outcome of peace by means of two states, because while it gives up ahead of time all the benefits, it also substantially minimizes the costs. Thank you.
Thank you.